Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lori Sherer. I'm a partner at Bain & Company, where I'm a leader in our advanced analytics practice. But I wasn't always in consulting. I spent a big chunk of my career working at FICO, the company that invented the credit score. And the credit score is one of the longest standing, more mature analytic, commercially grade analytics in the world, actually. And it's heavily, heavily regulated. It's mature and it's heavily regulated. The data that can go into it and how it can be used in practice is highly scrutinized. So what I'm impressed with as we fast forward 10, 15 years to where we are right now is we've really entered the wild, wild west in terms of huge proliferation of new sources of data, shortages of data science talent, so important choices about what are the things we work on. When we build a model, there are questions around, unintended consequences of that model, malicious uses of the model potentially, and permissible uses of data, and so on and so forth. So we're in a really, really murky time where there's a tremendous amount of subjectivity and judgment that needs to go into some of the decisions that companies and the individuals within those companies, the developers themselves, are making. So today we have a panel of esteemed colleagues here who are working for companies that are very forward-leaning on these topics and that have actually formalized in some shape or form their approach to these issues. So I'm going to ask, starting on the left, Tim to introduce himself and go down the line, and just ask you each to tell the audience, share with the audience a little bit about how your position came to be, what is your company's philosophy, why have we dedicated a function to this topic, and what draws you to this topic personally? Because I imagine you all made some career shifts into this, since it is a new role, and have made some trade-offs there. Tim?
So I'll go first.
Sure.
I'm Tim OBrien. I look after AI ethics advocacy for Microsoft. And the way my role came about is I kind of created it. My background at the company, I've been there 16 years, is primarily as an evangelist. Technology evangelism, I've spent most of my time at Microsoft with technical audiences. And around 2016, 2017, I started getting more and more interested in the part of AI related to what could go wrong. And this is where you started to see a lot of the research papers getting published about bias and fairness. So I started to get increasingly interested in it. And that time, around 2017, Microsoft was getting much more front-footed on principles, values, how this relates to mission. And the people shouldering the load on behalf of the company were people like Brad Smith, who's our president and chief legal officer, Eric Horvitz, who looks after Microsoft Research, and a lot of the policy experts and researchers that work for the two of them, respectively. These are busy people with day jobs doing this kind of on a part-time basis, and I started asking around, is this anyone's full-time job to advocate for this to our customers and partners who to this point had never been asked to consider any of this? And if not, why not? And the answer was no, and I don't know. So I just, at this point, my interest in the domain, my passion for this had reached a boiling point, and I just told my boss, this is where I want to marshal everything I've learned how to do to this point in my career. Wrote up a job description, socialized it with Eric and Brad and a lot of the people that work in that orbit. And everyone said, hey, we absolutely need this. And in May of last year, I walked away from a big global team and a big budget and all that to devote 100% of my energy to this. Talking to customers, partners, public speaking events like this, and a myriad of other things.
That's terrific. We're glad you did that. Kathy, you want to share your story?
Yes, so my background is in engineering psychology, human factors engineering, and spent the last couple of decades working in user experience research. And so that was what I was doing at Salesforce when Mark announced that we were going to become an AI company. And so I immediately started thinking about what are the ethical issues that we need to think about if we're going to go into AI. And I always had an interest in research ethics, and part of my role previously at Google was looking at research ethics. And so just started spending more and more of my time working with different Einstein teams and thinking about ethics. And early 2018, met our chief scientist, Richard Socher, and shared my work with him and got connected with him. And then by July, identified that this would be a fantastic role, wrote a V2 Mom, which is similar to like Google's OKRs. So basically a job description for this role, and pitched it to Richard, and Richard was like, yes, this is exactly what we need. And he went to Mark, and Mark was like, yes, this is exactly what we need. So this was very much a collaborative experience, where there's a recognition that yes, this is really adding value, and this is something that we want to formalize in our processes.
Great, thank you. And Margaret, what about in the case of Google?
Yeah, so I come from a machine learning background, focusing on natural language processing and computer vision, and vision to language systems. So Richard and I have sort of published in the same circles, and even had a session where our papers were back to back. But as I started developing these systems, I was starting to see the hints of the future, the hints of the technology as it was going to evolve over time, how it was going to start looking at the world and referring to things. And I started realizing that the skews in the data set was really affecting what it was going to say. And it started to really freak me out, because it was propagating stereotypes and biases. It was not understanding things that were harms, that were risks, not really understanding humanity underlying it, and talking about, explosions as being spectacular views, things like that. And it just kind of turned a page for me from being a machine learning researcher, like more specifically, to thinking about the long-term implications and the sort of end-to-end life cycle of AI, how it evolves over time. So I joined Google sort of pitching this idea that I really wanted to be a researcher that focused on the end-to-end development, bringing in policy, bringing in law, like really understanding the whole picture, and how we can create systems that don't propagate or amplify really problematic things about humans. And so I started joining a bunch of working groups of sort of other interested people, and then before I knew it, somehow I was managing some of these people, and it just sort of further took off from there, with support from the leadership at Google as well.
It sounds like one thing all three of you have in common is the leadership recognizes the importance of this, and while it sounds like each of you organically got to where you are, that you have strong support. And I think in the prior conversations too, each of you has expressed that that one of the requirements for stepping up into this job is having a fair amount of political capital and time under your belt at the organization. Are there any other sort of success factors you think for the role and for how people should think about trying to evangelize a role like this in their organizations?
I do think that there has to be that appetite, that appreciation among the executives that we need to have headcount dedicated specifically to this, and that they support you throughout. Even before I started reporting to Richard, he was a sponsor. Like once he was aware of my research and what I was doing, he started looping me into emails and conversations with our executives that I never would have known were happening, much less be able to contribute to those conversations. So having access at that level to bring my voice into those conversations was really important. And yeah, again, having already been at the company, not coming in brand new, I understood the technology. I had developed relationships across Einstein, our AI platform, across the Einstein teams in different clouds. And so all of those things just came together to make it sound like something that was just so natural and easy. And but it was time. It took a lot of time to develop that and build that to becoming a formalized role last August.
That's right.
Yeah, I would agree with that having like a leadership that supports the amount of time this kind of thing takes, and also being able to take a risk on impact that's not directly measurable. So, companies generally have these quarter-based systems, and you sort of are figuring out how well you've done based on quarters. But with something like ethics, you know you've succeeded when there's not a headline. So how do you measure the lack of headline, that kind of thing? So having support high up from management that understands the difficulty in measurement, the long-term kind of investment in this technology is really key.
I have the benefit of working for a company in which the senior leadership made an intentional decision to make it part of the culture. It's worth noting that we have a lot of researchers, both in AI and social science, in Microsoft Research and other parts of the company that have been sounding alarm bells on this for a long, long time, in some cases a decade or more. And I think it would be rude to dismiss that as grassroots, but it doesn't reach the level of senior executive sponsorship. And when Satya Nadella penned the op-ed piece in Slate in 2016, which you can look up, I think it's titled the Partnership for the Future, referring to partnership between man and machine. That's where he started to introduce the importance of transparency and fairness and accountability and privacy. And then 7 months later, he's keynoting a developer conference in front of 500 developers talking about Aldous Huxley and George Orwell. Now, we've all been to countless tech keynotes, and they all follow kind of a familiar format, a lot of optimism and a dabble of tech solutionism and a bunch of other crap. And Satya just said, look, the defining issue for this era of tech is going to be the collective responsibility we have not to screw this up. And that was a very sort of off-brand for a tech CEO.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Shortly thereafter, Future Computed was published. That was co-authored by Brad Smith and Harry Shum, who leads our AI and research business both report to Satya. So you start to see the groundswell at the senior leadership, and it validated all of that grassroots research that had been going on for years and years. And now it's just a thing. It's a thing at Microsoft. It's part of the culture. It's part of the fabric of how we run the company.
So culture, philosophy, senior leadership support, that sounds like table stakes, right, for what you're doing. Absolutely. But what about the practical side of it? I mean, you have companies with Google sprawling, lots of developing teams, and so on and so forth. How do you actually get going? How do you actually start creating processes, governance, checklists, whatever? Can you share with us a little bit about what have you done to actually start to implement these things?
So I guess my experience at Google has been working groups was sort of the start. So at Google, unsurprisingly, it's really easy to search for other people like you. Google does search, so it's useful. But I was able to find like-minded people and just sort of having meetings about what we would want to do and what recommendations we might want to have. And then we created an internal website that looked really cool, and teams started really thinking about it once we had a landing page where they could go and kind of see links to resources. And then teams started asking us to come and give presentations on what we were thinking. And then once we had teams who were sort of validating us, then it was much easier to bring the case up to the more senior leadership and see, look, there's a demand for this. And from there, the governance structures started being created and sort of everything from that.
That's great. And Kathy, I think earlier you ran a workshop on this topic, and you mentioned 5 or 6 really practical things that you just put in place at Salesforce around reviews. You want to share a little bit about some of the processes and so on that you've been able to get through?
Yeah, so starting last December, Danielle Cass and I began running workshops together. And today we had one earlier. Also did a survey amongst people who are in this field, and we found there are a number of things that will help you be more successful. And one of them is not to create net new practices. Take things that are already there and build onto them. So in the case of Salesforce, we already had a machine learning for PM's class, and so reached out to the instructor and said, hey, can I help teach that? Can I add in ethics into that course? And so now that class is taught every single month. And so as a foundation, ethics is built into that. Taking a look at whatever your product development processes are. We are on Agile, and so adding in ethical questions into the definition of ready and definition of done. That means it's just adding in questions to processes that teams are already doing. So don't create net new things, and then making experts available to people who need it. So having office hours or review boards. We already had our data science review board for teams to get feedback on the quality of their models and training data. And so that's something that Richard started when he joined. And so we just added in some ethics as one of the pieces of that review board. So taking a look at how can you make your expertise available at scale.
That's great. That's great advice, not to try to create a brand new governance structure, but rather insert this into things that people are already used to minimize the change management piece.
Yeah.
And what about you, Tim? You said your job sits between research and legal and product engineering.
Yeah.
How does that work? So how does that work at Microsoft in practice?
Those three entities, I think, come together in actually a new thing that we did create in the summer of 2017, which is a committee called Aether, which is an acronym for AI ethics and effects in engineering and research. It was conceived by Eric Horvitz, who runs Microsoft Research. Eric was actually an MD, PhD at Stanford before he switched to AI, but that Hippocratic ethos never really left him. He's one of these people who's been talking about this for 20 years. So he conceived this idea of a cross-functional ethics committee that would advise the senior leadership team on a lot of the issues that we're talking about. It was formed in the summer of 2017, but it really didn't do anything for 6 months. The idea was to listen to what customers were doing. If I've learned anything in all these years of doing evangelism, our customers are always much more creative than we are in thinking up what they're going to do with our products. And after about 6 months, the use cases that were potentially problematic fell into one of three buckets. These are consequential denial of services. This is loan applications, credit applications, physical harm, unsafe products, and infringement upon human rights. And given that harms framework, that's when we started to form working groups around Aether to tackle things like fairness and bias in machine learning, transparency and intelligibility, human-computer interaction, and so forth. And the key to this is cross-functional representation. Mm-hmm. So when customers come to us and say, hey, we want to form a committee like that, what should we do? Here's how my company is organized, where should we put it? And I tell them all the same thing, don't let your org chart get in the way of making sure you have lawyers, researchers, engineers, PR people. I mean, everyone has a different point of view of all of these things, and make sure that the representation is not only functionally diverse, but also diverse in the sense that we would traditionally think about it. Groups most likely to be impacted. You need women, people of color, you need gay employees involved in there, employees with disabilities, people whose lived experience can inform the way that entity operates and thinks about these issues.
That's terrific. And Margaret, earlier we were talking, and you just talked about ethics itself, and I thought that was a really insightful comment that you made, that ethics don't determine what's right and wrong.
Right, yeah. So I think a lot of people come into ethical AI at first thinking that the thing about ethics is that it tells you what to do. It tells you right and wrong. But once you start to actually dig into ethics, you realize that it's more about understanding different ways of thinking about and looking at the problems and sort of weighing different priorities. So you can have a deontological perspective, you can have a virtue perspective, you can have a utilitarian perspective. These are all sort of schools of thoughts of what is worth prioritizing and what can sort of be deprioritized. And so ethics basically just gives you the tools to think through essentially what should be different values. So this is where things like principles start coming in, values from companies start coming in, because that is the critical piece for you to start to understand what moves you're going to make within the company. And you could use the sort of ethical frameworks to think through, but really what determines what becomes ethical for you or for your company is what your company's values are and what their principles are.
That's a great answer. So when we think about, the question of who's responsible, right? We have regulation coming in, that sort of covers some of privacy and security sort of concerns, but feels to me woefully inadequate in some of these way more judgmental kinds of decisions. But nonetheless, they play a role. You have regulators, you have industry associations, you have companies like yourself who have taken a leadership position in creating these roles. And then you have people on the front line, the actual analysts and data engineers and people who are building these things. I'd be curious to know, in that balance of who's responsible, what are some of your perspectives about where the leverage is and who is responsible and who's going to have the biggest influence on the way things come out and the way things work?
This was actually a question In Stack Overflow's 2018 developer survey, the Stack Overflow included ethics questions in the 2018 survey. I don't know why they took them off for 2019, but it asked that question: who's responsible? And it was all over the place. You know, senior management, the person who wrote the line of code, the person who came up with the idea, and nobody really seems to know. I think the principles that define corporate governance are kind of a good grounding. I get asked this question all the time. Hey, tell me about your ethics board. Are they really empowered? You know, do they really make decisions? And I said, well, no. The stakeholders in the company, employees, shareholders, the board of directors, hold the senior leadership accountable for making decisions. Would you own stock in a company whose CEO said at the shareholder meeting, hey, that wasn't my call. I outsourced that accountability to a committee. I mean, you would never accept that as an answer. So corporate governance, senior leadership, as being a receiver of advice, input, I think is an important kind of grounding. These new issues, all this new dynamics that we're dealing with doesn't change, I think, the principles of corporate governance, in my view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say it's similar too with Google setting up governance structures, and then you can kind of filter through basic decisions to have the really risky ones or the ones that involve a lot of money, or things that are likely to cause a lot of headlines. That can be sort of put upward to the top leadership.
Right, there's a tiered escalation.
It's a tiered escalation, exactly, and that's really key. It's super useful.
So that's a little bit of where the buck stops, right? But I participated in a workshop at Stanford recently where they brought the design school, the D school, over to the engineering school and ran a symposium on design principles, where one of the key thrusts were how do we use human-centered design and design principles in our development processes. So I'm curious, from your perspective, on the front lines when people are conceiving this stuff, building this stuff, and so on, what do you think the things are that you all can do to, because a lot of these decisions are made, deep down, layers and layers below, right? And may not trickle up to governance.
There's a great quote by Norberto Andre from Facebook, who said, ethics lives in the small engineering decisions that are made every day. And that's so true, that we have to be able to provide individuals the tools to be able to think through what are the unintended consequences, both positive and negative. When we identify the unintended consequences, what are the resources that we have available in order to mitigate them? So Everyone has this great consequence scanning workshop methodology, but there are a ton of other tools that are out there. They also have this 37-page document of tools and frameworks and other things that are there. It's a matter of making sure that everyone in the company understands what the values are. And then you work from there. When we understand what our values are and we start thinking about what are the unintended consequences of what we are creating, then we can think about, like, how far do we want to go to mitigate that? Is it through your policies? You're going to forbid customers. Are you going to put physical blockers in the way that prevent end users from doing specific things? Or are you not going to build something at all because you're so concerned that this particular harm might be created? And so being able to, again, have those tools, have the values in place that you can have those conversations, having access to experts to think through it, and then having the incentive structure or the support from management that if a decision is made to say, you know what, we're not going to launch this, that there will be that support there, that people don't feel like this is something we talk about, but at the end of the day, we still have to launch it regardless.
And I think, sorry?
Go ahead.
I think that this is really where the diversity and inclusion aspect really starts to come in. Like when you're thinking about humans and being sort of human-centric in your design and figuring out your values, what really matters there are what the diverse perspectives are at the table from day one, making the decision not to use this data set because I don't see people who look like me, these kinds of things there. So this is really where I think diversity and inclusion starts to really strongly intersect with the ethics space, because that's the different perspectives, that's the different value systems coming to play and making the decision in that line of code that, we're going to not look at gender or, these kinds of things. Yeah.
I think you hit the nail on the head with respect to where these small decisions get made. A lot of the technical people in our industry have never been asked to think about this, not at university, not in their careers. And so I think we need to be respectful of just how kind of where they're starting from and meet them where they are. I know checklists, for example, get a bad rap. They get kicked around on Twitter all the time. I'm actually in favor of them. I think it's like a great place to start. So just providing the tools, providing the help, providing the assistance to help get people started.
Well, that's great. I think the world is very fortunate to have 3 such talented people with your organizations behind you on this topic. It's such an important topic going forward for our whole field. I just wanted to conclude with each one of you maybe leaving this audience with either something that inspires you or a call to action, something you wish that others would take up in their own lives.
Maybe one call to action would be to share with the world more of the risks that you've taken and more of the risk mitigation. So transparency is one of the big issues here, and kind of no one wants to go first. So the more open we can be about the kinds of things that we're seeing, that we're concerned about, and that we've mitigated, the better we can all evolve the sort of ethical AI space together.
High tide rises all boats, and so coming together, sharing with each other as much as possible, like the workshop that we did today, so that we learn from each other what's working, what's not working, and supporting each other. It's easy to be critical of each other and to be very divisive and to accuse one of being, virtue signaling or ethics washing. But if we support each other and come together, I think we'll all be much stronger, and society will benefit as a result of that if we can all help move in that direction.
If you have a passion for this and you think you can contribute and be additive within your company, don't ask for permission to engage and don't wait for someone to invite you. Just do it, regardless of what your role is and where you work in the company. This is one of these weird domains in which being a pest, banging on doors, being an irritant is actually acceptable. In some cases, you cross a Rubicon when you do that, and you get permission. So don't hesitate.
Well, thank you all for being brave pioneers in this field and in our industry, and thanks for sharing your views with our audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.